to our virtual Creative Morning stage to talk on the theme of home and creativity. Welcome in, Kathy Zarsky.
It is such an honor to be here. I have been living a relatively secluded life, probably many of you relate, for most of the pandemic. We started getting out and having some activities that were fairly routine last fall, but we've limited them to the things that were really most important to our family and our needs. And so to be here today and to actually be in a place that is really reminiscent of my own home, where I do feel very much at home outside, really just is an uplifting experience for me. And the theme of home is an interesting topic. It does dovetail very nicely into my life story. And so we're going to start there, because the stories that we tell ourselves are the stories that define the world. They define us. But sometimes our stories are missing really crucial components. Sometimes we have misunderstood elements in our stories. Sometimes they're a little upside down and backwards, similar to what you might see in a reflection if you went to go visit the Bean in Chicago. And so I challenge this idea of home as more than just the place that we live. And I'm going to kind of walk you through my story to help you understand how I've kind of been transforming this story over time. So this is my reference habitat. I grew up in South Dakota, the northeast corner of South Dakota. My ecoregion is the Minnesota River Prairie ecosystem. And I really grew up sandwiched between these planar landscapes of field and really vast sky. Very important shaping elements for my upbringing. I think a lot of you may describe where you grew up, if you grew up in a city, by the character of the buildings, perhaps a diverse population, cultural attractions. This is all really in stark contrast to what I grew up in. I had to visit places like this. You maybe had to come and visit places like where I grew up. I was a runner. This is literally what the roads look like, just long and straight. They went on forever, and I chased that horizon. On that horizon, to me, was possibility. It just lured me like a magnet. When you live in really expansive landscapes, the physical sensation that I literally feel in my body is this need to move and move quickly. This is not a place where I really walked slowly, something I'm going to talk about coming up. I moved through these landscapes. I had a very active imagination. You know, I was alone a lot of the times growing up in kind of a rural setting like this. I did, go to school. I did run cross country and had teammates and things like this, but I was predominantly alone a lot of the time. Kind of thinking about this place where I lived and what it meant for me to call this place home, but how chasing that possibility, that thing that was just over the horizon, was too powerful of a tug for me to resist. Something else that I experienced in this setting was not just the landscape, something that is possible no matter where we live, and that is this undeniable, indescribable sense of awe under an expansive night sky. I had the privilege living where I lived, having really dark skies, and I would often go on night runs, lay on the hood of my car and just gaze and get lost and feel so incredibly fortunate to be alive, that somehow having my life, despite not knowing where it was going and what its purpose was, indeed had purpose. And chasing this sense of awe has been something else. It's been a really foundational part of my story. But then, like all of us, at some point I left all of those familiar things. I had to go out into the world. I was chasing these possibilities. I was full of doubt because the first place I went when I left home was to another country. I moved to Norway. I didn't speak the language. Culturally, I'm Swedish. There was a lot of familiar sort of cultural parts of living in Norway, but I felt very alone for quite a long time. Beautiful landscape, as beautiful as any picture postcard you've ever seen. It is literally that beautiful. Came back to college, went back to Norway, got married, traveled extensively to Morocco, came back to Austin, started my architecture degree, got divorced, started my career. All kinds of things happened, just like big upheavals here and there that kind of kept redefining elements of my life. I couldn't really get a hold of like what was my identity, what was my purpose. I live here, is this home? I'm not sure. At the same time that I was starting my family, both of my parents passed away. Both of my kids were babies. And so this sense of unconditional love also was suddenly missing, and I was floundering for quite a while. At the same point that I'm coming to a realization that sustainability, this call to nature, was really firmly rooted in me, and that I was wayfinding, trying to determine how I sort of brought that life to the work that I do. And so this new reference habitat that I'm in, these ecoregions are the Edwards Plateau and the Blackland Prairie ecoregions. I am more on the Edwards Plateau. West Cave is Edwards Plateau. Both of these ecoregions have very defining characteristics that they've brought to this region, and lots of very different features from what I was accustomed to. We have the karst. I'm a rock climber, and so I'm featuring some of the benefit of those features above and beyond just creating that sponge for our water systems and the supply for our aquifers. But lots of other kinds of things that were brand new to me, that were scratchy, that were foreign. This is my kids' reference habitat now. This is the place where they are learning to love to be outside. And this was a problem for me. I didn't share this love. I was definitely not in love with this place. And this is the work that I was doing. I was immersed in an industry that was primarily in Austin, primarily in the urban core, creating conditions for sustainable outcomes. And most buildings, if you stop and think about it, are focusing our energies on the conditions they create for the inhabitants inside. Buildings are habitats unto themselves for the kinds of programs that they're set to serve. And rarely do buildings have the same kind of programmatic considerations to create conditions on the outside of that building envelope for the greater community around them. Buildings are singularly responsible for most of the challenges that they face and to achieve them on their own. I had a really pivotal moment back in 2002 when the first Green Bill took place in Austin. Herbert Dreisettel, a German landscape architect and urban planner, he's an artist, sculptor, did a presentation that just blew me away. He was introducing blue-green infrastructure to cities all around Germany and in Europe, where water and nature were key ecosystem service functions that were celebrated in the hearts of the cities. Water stood in the middle of plazas that had been treated, where kids could play and reflect light, at night onto the sides of buildings to be very artistic. Vegetation was lush and rich and was purifying the waters. Things were channelized through vegetation versus buried in pipes. And it really got me thinking about how the environmental movement that we were embarking on in the United States was referencing the environment over and over and over again. But rarely was I surrounded by anyone that could really talk deeply to me about it, that really understood what it was about the ecology of this place that was important for me to understand. And that was a moving, kind of pivotal moment for me to kind of shift my thinking into going from being a sustainability advisor and strategist to wanting to immerse myself more in the other sciences. And those are biomimicry and biophilia. So biophilia, and just to kind of go through these terms, and then I won't refer to them anymore, is our innate love of nature. The characteristics and the attributes of nature that make us feel a certain way. We love the sound of water and the rustling of leaves. We love dappled light. We know that we like the sense of refuge and shelter. We know that we also love the expansive view that I explained on the prairie because it makes us feel safe. We have prospect. Biomimicry, on the other hand, is the emulation of strategies that we can observe in nature. So if we were to look at a tree that has that dappled light, it has the rustling leaves, it has these beautiful branching patterns that you can see. Well, I guess you can't see the branching patterns, you can see the trunks. But the texture of the trunks, if you were to touch them, these are all qualities of the tree that we admire. But the leaves on the trees may have tips that are breaking the raindrops to reduce the amount of erosive wear at the ground around where they stand. The branching patterns are efficient for the structures that they are supporting, in addition to the types of hydraulic lift and distribution of resources that they have to have to put in place. So all these other kinds of strategies, what can we learn from these? How does that inform the way that we can design? How do we have a new reference library of strategies that nature has provided over 3.8 billion years? My interest in biomimicry quickly also, as I was learning more about ecology, was that we can't really isolate a tree from the system that it lives. And so living systems start to scale my thinking around biomimicry and biophilia, because up until this point, when I started my real immersion into biomimicry in 2011, it was around industrial design and product scale types of applications. And I was really interested in leaping up to that systems scale. So I've written some pieces that have gotten widely circulated, and if anyone would like to just read a little bit more about biophilia at the scale of the city, we actually have an initiative in Austin for Biophilic Austin that is part of an international biophilic cities partnership. And the Austin Central Library was one of my favorite projects, with some of my favorite clients. The people with the city were fantastic. But under this project, we also did the improvements along Shoal Creek. And I used a lot of the work of that project to refer to the possibility for the city at scale, because Austin has some pretty lofty aspirations there. And so I recommend, if you have time, to look at this paper to get a better understanding of the way biophilia is being applied and the way we're striving to apply it at the scale of cities. But if we're going to surround ourselves with nature and all of the things that we love about nature, I highly encourage all of us to then simultaneously tap this deep, innate sense of curiosity that we all had when we were kids. It's the reason we spent time outside. It's the reason when our boredom really we couldn't take it any longer. We had to just let that switch light us up and go let it, lead us to whatever discoveries it may lead us to. And so curiosity is a really viable, important trait for the practice of understanding nature, because it builds empathy. If you're spending time with something, you get to know it better, you care, you're more likely to become a steward of the place, you're more likely to develop close relationships with people if you invest and express curiosity to know who they are. These things are really important. They also say that curiosity makes for happier people, but maybe happier people are more curious. You guys can debate that amongst yourselves. So we need to imagine, if we have defined our world by the stories that we've told ourselves, we've been telling ourselves degenerative stories. And one of the reasons it's so hard for people to know how to step in and act and feel like they can impact change is because those degenerative stories make us feel powerless. These are stories around scarcity. But do we really have scarcity? Nature is a genius at creating abundance. 75% of the world consumes diets that consist of 12 crops and 6 animal species. But we have hundreds of thousands of species that are edible. We aren't eating localized diets. We aren't pulling from indigenous wisdom of the place to know how to source and live in this place. One example of a false narrative of scarcity that really isn't true, where biomimicry and living systems have a lot that they can teach us. So how then do we flip the script to create regenerative narratives? What we really need to imagine is more about the places that we live. How do they thrive? How has everything else managed to survive in these places, dealing with the pressures that they've had to deal with for 3.8 billion years as they've evolved and adapted in place to be so successful? And the reason they're successful is one pretty simple foundational principle, is they're creating conditions conducive to life. So how do you observe these things, right? How do you try to discover for yourself what these conditions are? And I recommend more than anything else is to just be outside. Take a slow walk. Don't run through it so quickly with your mind racing that you can't really observe what's around you. Walk slowly. Look slowly. There's a whole movement called slow looking. Give yourself time. I'm really fortunate. I live on 6 acres, very similar to the setting where I'm at today. And every morning about this time, I would literally be outside with my goats, with my boots on, walking through the tall grass so I don't get the chiggers and the fire ants and all of the things. But they're browsing. They take me to a place and we just park. And I observe and get to visit the same places again and again and again. And you would think that a familiar place over time isn't really going to tell me that much. But these places change seasonally, after a rain, based on other encounters that may be going on there. Nothing is ever the same as what you might have expected from what you saw the day before. And it's one of the best ways to really get to deeply know a place. And if you spend this kind of time with any person in your life, I think you can kind of predict what the result of that behavior is. You really develop an intimacy that you can't ignore, an intimacy that calls you to really nurture that relationship. I've really fallen deeply in love. That's how far the intimacy of place has gone with me. So on these daily walks, they're fairly serendipitous. Go to a place that you pass every day and you don't think you're going to see anything new until one day slime mold is all over it. Last year in February and March, we had a small little clump of slime mold that I observed. It's bright yellow, it's pretty hard to miss. That just kept changing and morphing and eventually took over most of our wood chip pile. And this is an amazing sort of decomposer. It's in search of nutrients. And the way that it does is that it sets up these really efficient connective networks. And so it's a brainless system, but it has figured out how to go out and scout for resources and use the shortest distance possible through all of these different networks that it's sending out to then kind of stick with the one to source what it needs. And then it sends out spores and it keeps going through this process where it's very cyclic, and then it comes up again and it decays. Sometimes it looks like a loaf of bread. Sometimes it literally does look like dog vomit, which is one of its common names, but it's fascinating. You can literally put a time lapse on it and watch it, and it's the most amazing thing ever to really watch. And why does this matter? Why should we be so fascinated with the goings on of slime mold? Well, we have AI and software, generative software companies looking at sort of the principles and the strategies of these connective networks. We're looking at how to better plan highways, and lots of different industry sectors are realizing there is something going on that's so simple that we could glean in order to apply and improve some of our own systems. I love ash juniper trees. Call me out, hate me if you like. I don't have the allergies. I think they're a gorgeous sculptural tree. They put down all kinds of needle duff. And in the needle duff of ash juniper trees, so much crazy business is going on. And if you didn't visit these same places every day, you really might just miss a whole world underneath your feet. These little mushrooms are the tiniest little guys you've ever seen, like tiny, tiny. And they happen to have just enough pop of color where I could spot them on this day. But in general, they're a fruiting body of a mycelial network underneath a duff of needles doing amazing resource distribution. These networks of, these mushroom factories the mycelial factories are distributing water and chemicals to a whole vast network and colony of trees and vegetation. And these communities are also using these networks to send chemical signals when they're under attack, to share with their neighbors information about what threats may be about so that they can put up their defenses. And this kind of resource distribution, these strategies about how to organize and communicate are also lessons that we are looking at through a biomimicry lens. And who hasn't seen a bunch of cicadas lately? I have yet to be right on the spot when they are emerging from their original exoskeleton. I have seen a lot of freshy freshes, but the thing with the freshy fresh is how are they not susceptible to all of the bacteria and everything else just coming out? They're just like newborn babies, and they should be prey to all kinds of little microscopic buggies. And the reason they're not is on both sides of their wings, they have a hexagonal pattern of these cone-shaped spikes that are called nanopillars, and they're like nails on water balloons of the dangerous bacteria that plague them. They just pop them. But they also have a symbiotic relationship with probiotic beneficial bacteria. They've co-evolved together. So those bacteria happen to have a rigid shell, and they're immune to the structure of these nanopillars. So why is this important? Well, nature does amazing things at these microscopic and nanoscopic kind of scales on surfaces. And so this is actually an inspiration for how we could treat, medical equipment, food sanitation, all kinds of areas where bacteria is also a threat in our own environment, and where we don't want to have to continue to introduce more chemicals and other kinds of things into our world. We can do things naturally the way nature does. Something that I see on misty, humid days right after a rain more than others is just how pervasive the spider webs are around us. They are literally everywhere. We're walking on them. They're little, they're big, they're crisscross, they're big, like medallions hanging between trees that call our attention. Sometimes there's a spider right smack in the middle. Sometimes it's off on the side. Spider webs are fascinating. They are everywhere. And when the sun is just kind of low in the horizon still, it peeks through and it sets off this UV like rainbow, kind of effect. And this is intentional. Many spider webs, not all, but many spiders actually weave a UV reflective strand into their webs to attract certain insects, but also to deter larger birds, animals like birds. And so Ornilux is a glass company that has really picked up on this idea and has put a coating on their windows that is patterned with a similar UV reflective kind of grid that would resemble a web to inhibit bird collisions, which are such a huge issue with all of the glass that we have in our world. Many webs are also like muscles. Webs perform really well in tension, but they can also contract and do a lot of the things that we see with mussels. And this gives them a lot more resistance around the edges, especially of these medallion style configurations that we see. And that quality of a web acting like a mussel gives us a lot more insights too into the way something as fine as a spider web, which there's a lot of innovation around right now, in the various ways in which it can be used. And if you are kind of a touchy-feely person like me, you want to look at the thing, you want to sketch the thing, you want to touch it, nature's really fuzzy. And we have all kinds of degrees of fuzz. And this fuzz that we see especially on leaves and on the stems of different plants, these are called trichomes. And they do a lot of different things. They create microclimates by creating microshade on the plant. They create a nice little wind sort of buffer so that in really windy conditions, you have kind of this insulative layer between those little hairs. They are collecting water and helping droplets stay a little bit longer on those leaf systems to either help cool them and or help hydrate them. And we have lots and lots and lots of examples of this kind of strategy. This is a little cactus that also, needles on cacti are actually just modified leaves, but here you can see the density of these hairs doing a lot of these same functions, but this is a much more these exist in much harsher climates, and so they really have to amp up that kind of strategy for the plant. And here's an interesting view of structurally just how much shade can be created, not just by these trichomes, but by the structure of the plant itself. More of that plant is in shade than will ever be in the sun, just based on the morphology of the plant. And then you can see just how neatly organized everything is to give the most efficient distribution of those needles and those hairs. Go to Wikipedia and just type in leaves, and it's just like, it'll blow your mind. There's so much to know about leaves. So this is a plant just right outside my door that is just beautiful. Again, it's lovely to touch. But what it's doing right here, based on this really symmetrical paired organization of these leaves, is that it's bouncing light and sharing light within that plant system and curling and flexing with those leaves to allow light to also penetrate deeper down into that system, depending on the time of day. Lots of really innovative ways for us to think about adaptive, responsive systems, perhaps for buildings to reduce glare, to reduce the wind, to change the view, any number of things to help us regulate thermal conditions just by having responsive, adaptive systems similar to what we see here in these leaves. I hope some of you have gotten to see one of my favorite plants. This is a sensitive plant. We have lots of different plants that look like this. The way to know that if it's a sensitive plant, it has the characteristics that I'm about to describe is to look for these beautiful, like cutesy little pom-pom flowers on them. But these have have a response system where if you stroke the leaf, they immediately curl up because this is their impulse to protect against unwanted threats. The stem of these plants is really kind of spiny and prickly, and so it's a really uncomfortable thing. If you decide you want to go and eat that plant, it's going to expose that to your mouth or your fingers pretty quickly. But you can start to touch it one area, and then the whole plant, the more you disturb it, that whole plant will just move right in front of your eyes. And it's a pretty fun thing to really observe and think about in terms of another example of a responsive design in nature. I shared this with Ben, and I just wanted to bring it up because, you know, one of the areas of work that I've done a lot of is consult with clients around how to bring nature into the space. You know, in the places that we work in particular, we are well aware that our built environment has stripped us of the nature that we so crave. And so there are lots of different ways that we traditionally have thought about doing this. One is just literally bring plants into the space. I would say if you're going to do that, think about specifically where they are best needed and what kind of properties do those plants have? Are they there to clean the air? Are they just to be a visual sight cue? Can they do something more to create spatial gradients so they're more strategically placed in areas to do those things to the best of their ability? But other ways that we have thought about incorporating nature in the space is to bring in the forms and the designs of nature that we love so much, that we instinctively know come from nature. This example right here, if those of you watching aren't familiar with it, is a really beautiful, like 6-foot diameter pufferfish nest. The male spends quite a bit of time, exhaustive amount of time, creating this system with his tail, and he picks up all of these little stones to make sure he's got the finest sand right there in the middle. And he just dances and he dances and he dances and does this artistic, beautiful thing. And he attracts a mate. And they have their eggs and they rest right there in the middle. And if you look at those patterns, these are patterns that are ubiquitous in a lot of different systems across the natural world. But these are sort of energy mitigating patterns that are actually calming the waters that go over the top of that nest so that those eggs stay perfectly in place until those fish are ready to emerge. So we can emulate these forms, and we see them immediately as an artistic expression that we can add to our space. There's a biophilia recognition, with these kinds of things. But I would ask our curiosity to take us one step further and think about what is the original purpose of these kinds of forms? What are they capable of doing for us? What is the inherent potential of that form? Dependent on the material that we use. Can it be more absorptive? Can it be something that is an acoustic treatment? Can it do something else to regulate the environment for us rather than be just an amenity for the sake of being an amenity? And the point that I really want to make at the end of all of this is that while we've talked about and I've shared these individual observations that I've had, these are all part of larger living systems. Everything is highly interconnected and highly interdependent, nested locally and then within, regional, biome, and global scaled systems. We have a world right now that's really, this last week alone, going through some alarming shocks. And we're seeing similar kinds of shocks happening locally. So this beautiful image that you see is from a living rock at the Grotto of West Cave. We all know that iconic image of the falls, but the grotto really is a whole system of living rock features that have created this wonderful, beautiful, really, it's a jewel in the hill country that is precious, but it is only in existence because of the living connective tissue of the place. Hines Branch Creek is in the upland prairie, which doesn't get the praise and the love that it deserves, but it is sort of the feedstock for the water that comes to the falls, creates the pond, that generates the springs, that give life to these rocks, to have all of these plants and all of these animals living in harmony down in this grotto. And our change in water, the variability of water, our climate changes, are constantly putting these kinds of features at risk. And while Austin has a sense of identity of the place that I think typically our stories have led us to believe that it's the buildings and it's the music and it's the food and it's the vibrancy, it's the keep it weirdness, it's the laid back attitude of the place. It's all of these other things. There's so much more connective tissue that sustains this place. It's what attracted us to this place. And so now when I think about home, home isn't this place I live. Home is this place that I know. I've changed my story. It's a generative story. I believe that you all can have a regenerative story by spending time in this place, by going beyond sort of those edges to see the way that these things are all interconnected and feeding on each other and how rich they are as a result. That biodiversity is an inherent part of the health of this place. And it's only through deep, like unconditional love that we can save this place, right? In the same capacity that we constantly rally around the music industry, that we are rallying around all of these other things that we know really make up the culture of this place. Do we really understand the iconic wisdom of this place? Are we key? Are we in kinship to the place that we live? Because this place needs us desperately. So I have a couple of asks that I would share and a couple of invitations. I love my slow walks, and if anyone is interested, I am totally open to anyone joining me and meeting my goats and having a lovely walk. They are different depending on the time of year, but many different things to enjoy. The same as going out to West Cave. Don't just go there one time of year. Go there different seasons of the year, because no two seasons offer the same two things, and it really sort of shares more of the richness and the potential of the place. Get a membership to West Cave. Support organizations that are not only preserving these really special places, but are telling the story that makes them part of the connective tissue to Austin, to this region. They are not destinations, they are connective tissue. Thank you so much.
So many of us are familiar with the blue juniper as its false name, the cedar. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what it is, in your opinion, to see a native species being treated like an invasive species, or whether it is being invasive in its behavior, as one of the articles posted suggested, and what it means to welcome in or to have changes in our home that we don't necessarily like.
Yeah. One of the things that, I have come to see by spending, slow time in nature is that many of our plants have the same behaviors that we see in the ash juniper. The ash juniper has always been a part of this ecosystem. The oak savanna, the juniper oak savanna sort of is one of the defining characteristics of the ecology of this place. But the people that used to live on this place, the indigenous peoples of this place, were very proactively, in relationship with the place. There was fire on this place that helped regulate the behavior of these trees. And when you start to change the relationship with the ecology of the place, the behavior of these trees has no of its natural sort of evolved adaptation strategies to kind of keep it in check. I think one of the reasons the cedars have been so vilified, quite honestly, is we have false ideas about sort of them being water hogs, but more so is people have these, some people have pretty severe allergies to them. I know people that actually have more severe allergies to oaks, but we don't talk about our oaks that way. Perhaps it's because historically they have been more revered for their, the way that they've been kept. They're just so majestic and so iconic to this region. That's a really interesting question, to ask yourself. If you have allergies with both trees, why is one so despised over the other? I think the other thing that we hear is that that the junipers really don't support much life around the base. The only place that I see coral root orchids are under the base of junipers. The only place that I'm seeing the vast majority of ladies' trusses is underneath these junipers. It's where the sedges are growing. It's where so many other kinds of things really are thriving. The vast majority of the mushrooms that I go and observe after these big rains, I see some in the leaf duff, but it's mainly in the needle duff under the junipers. So they're really a hugely important part of this ecosystem.
Were those your photos? Those were beautiful photos.
Yes.
Amazing. Really, really beautiful town there. And I'm so glad you got to display that as well to us. And um, do you share your photos in any other place that we could see them?
Uh, I literally have thousands. I take my camera with me most places. I have shared several on Instagram. That's probably where I would share them the most.
Nice.
In the past, I've shared them with a friend of mine. His name is Tim McGee. He has this really cool site where he had shared photos, but I'm not sure if that is still up and live. I guess post talk, I can add some more things to my bio with these kinds of resources for anyone that's interested.
That would be great. That'd be great. And I think your Instagram is on your bio too. So if you want to see more of Kathy's photos, you can go to her Creative Mornings bio, which we have linked from the event page, or you can just search her name on Creative Mornings. Are there any other questions from y'all? Okay, here we go. Here's Farhana. Did I say your name right? I'm so sorry if I didn't. But uh, he or she, I don't even know gender, so I'm going to say they asked, what is the deal with hackberry trash trees? Why are people constantly telling me to cut those down? Do you know that?
Well, I can give you what I believe the right answer is, but I would always encourage you to talk to an ecologist, someone that's actually managing the landscapes. They are also native to this place, but I think we don't celebrate the beauty of the hackberry the way that we celebrate the beauty of other trees. They may come up in places where we didn't intend. They come up pretty easily. They grow in a lot of different conditions. They aren't the most long-lived and robust tree. So I really think it's more about aesthetic preference and the way that our stories have carved out space for them in our landscapes. But again, I wouldn't be the expert on any of the other kinds of failings of the tree that have led to, the way they're perceived in our stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're going down a route where we might be asking you to do some landscaping tips. So I want to pull it back and actually ask you one more question. I'll give everyone a little more chance. If you have another question, please put it in chat. But I'll ask this one more I've been thinking about, and I do see a raised hand. So, what has been either your favorite or maybe the harder to see example of biomimicry in some of the building or urban planning projects that you've done? Is there a place in Austin where we might see that? You brought up the Central Library, but maybe it's is there a way that biomimicry has come into your work in a creative way that you just thought was a quintessential example or just a favorite of yours?
More of the biophilic design is what you will see, which is really manifest in the library. Lake Flato was the architect for that project together with Shipley Bullfinch out of Boston. And together they really did a magnificent job of bringing in a lot of those, the elements of nature, whether it would be a view or orientation, the kinds of respite spaces they created in the landscape. Biomimicry has been a little bit of a harder thing to incorporate, mainly because it requires a scientific brief. If you think about the way we approach most design, we have a script that requires that we follow a certain sort of contractual process. And to engage in sort of scientific inquiry and innovate new systems is a really challenging commitment, and it has to happen at the right time. So if you really aren't brought in at the right time, I tend to see that some of those applications are a little bit more surface. They aren't really so deep. They may be a little bit too metaphorical versus that true scientific iteration of the principle that you observed. I know that in the new, not the under construction, but the Google space downtown, they actually in their auditorium space looked at fractalized systems as a biophilic component, but also as a means to really look at the acoustics of the space. We spent quite a bit of time with them using the acoustic challenge of an open office work plan as the place where we would explore both biomimicry and biophilia.
Very cool. All right, Anne has her hand raised. Anne has a question.
I do. And you actually did kind of a nice setup, Ben, because if I had it to do over again, Kathy, I would love to be you when I grow up professionally. But that ship has probably sailed. But I am curious, because there is such a scientific underpinning to some of this stuff, what are the best resources for lay people who, can't go off and get architecture degrees and can't go off and get science degrees, but maybe want to start to learn more about how to incorporate this thinking into our spaces?
Yeah, it's a community discipline. This is a highly integrated interdisciplinary discipline. And the reason I went to West Cave actually is because I will never know what I need to know on my own. I wanted to work alongside conservation ecologists and have access to the people that are doing research at that place. I want their stories. I want what they know. I want to ask them the questions that no one has asked them before that might stump them for a while, but kind of have that journey together. So, it really is about pairing with the other expertise that is needed, whether it be a biologist, an ecologist. The artistic component and the translation piece of this is huge, because what may be well understood in the scientific community is not accessible to lay people. We do need the right wording. We do need the right sort of visuals to be able to interpret. Like, this is a huge translation piece for us to be able to take, that deep science and then use it in a different domain outside of what nature, does with its recipes. Something else that I would just encourage, I was going to do this and I forgot, but other places where you can just spend deep time in nature and get really intimate so you can start to form your own questions. Go volunteer with my good friend Peppy out at Jester King. They have a regenerative ag, system out there where they're spending lots of time on the land. He has a magnificent herd of goats. 2 of my goats came from him, but a lot of hands-on work where you're in a really beautiful setting on the edge of town. Where they're really trying to go back to, how to preserve land on the edge of the city that would otherwise be developed to be, sort of this productive, regenerative slice that we all, cherish and then protect. So it's interdisciplinary. Find yourself a good team of people and, keep them close. My people that I work with are scattered all over the world sometimes.
Thank you.
Well, we have benefited from this greatly, Kathy. I feel like my eyes have been open to so many different things, and I can't actually wait to go for a walk and to try to put some of what you've brought to us into my own senses and my own experience. So thank you so much for bringing a bit of your world to this community. Thank you for being a part of it. Thank you for also leaving your home to set up in a completely different space. Thank you again, Marty. I know you're there. Thank you, Kim. I know you're there for helping make that happen. This is a labor of love, and everyone who does it is a volunteer. So I want to thank our volunteer organizers, Brian, who's in his home. Thank you, Brian. Today, we also had Anne as our director, who you saw. She asked a great question. Thank you, Anne. Kaylee has been our assistant director. Robin and Rosie, our prize patrol, making sure Nicole got breakfast this morning. Also helping out has been Brittany with our links and chat. Thank you to our entire Creative Mornings community for making this happen. But thank you all for being here and being part of this and sticking with us a little long. We went a little long, but not too far. And of course, Henry Invisible, who's, I think, was laying a bed of music underneath your whole talk, Kathy. It was pretty awesome to kind of watch him in the periphery. We're so glad that y'all were able to make it here today. We'll see you next month for a new theme and a new Creative Mornings. But for right now, have a great weekend, and we love y'all. We'll see you next time.
Excellent. Have a Creative Mornings, everybody.